Bookseller Crow on the books. Talks across the pond.
Good evening and welcome to the latest in our Talks Across the Pond. Tonight I'm delighted to welcome Laura Lippman, Jean Hanff Korelitz, who are going to be interviewed by Barry Forshaw. It promises to be very exciting. Over to you, Barry.
Thank you, Jonathan. Well, I'm excited because I read a hell of a lot of crime novels, and I have to say how impressive these two were and how they made my job so easy. So I'm Barry Forshaw. I'm the crime critic of the Financial Times, and I'm the author of several books in which I've written about Laura Lippman. Not as yet Jean Hanff Korelitz, but I'm sure it will come. So in Crime Fiction: The Reader's Guide, I said about Laura Lippman's diamond-hard prose and quirky characterization epitomize the best in American crime writing. And in American noir, because I've written in Laura about half a dozen different books, I said, anatomizing a murky criminal past is meat and drink to writers of crime fiction, but few do it as well as Laura Lippman. And as well as conjuring the individual dilemmas of the women at the center of After I'm Gone, she's particularly adroit at a period when women were only starting to enjoy some autonomy. So we have here two women who do enjoy autonomy. So Laura, we'll be talking about your new book, and the title, please?
Dream Girl.
Dream Girl, okay. Then we also have another impressive American writer who claims not to be a crime writer, or maybe doesn't like being put into that category yet. But the plot is definitely a crime novel. Jean Hanff Korelitz, her latest novel is The Plot. She was born and raised in New York City, educated at Dartmouth College and Clare College, Cambridge. She's the author of seven novels, including The Devil and Webster, You Should Have Known, which a lot of people will know from the 2020 HBO series, The Undoing, Admission, adapted as the 2013 film of the same name, The White Rose, Sabbath Day River, and A Jury of Her Peers. With her husband, the poet Paul Muldoon, she adapted James Joyce's The Dead as an immersive theatrical event. I have got some James Joyce behind me. That's just to be pretentious, but you'll have to forgive that. So the plot, let's start with that, Jean. So it is, one thing we critics never use is the following phrase, a page turner, because it's such a cliche, but the plot is a page turner.
Thank you.
Is that what you were aiming for?
No, the novel came about in such a bizarre way that my aim was to sort of get through the experience of writing it. I was trying to persuade my editor to say yes to a different novel that I'd been working on for years, and she kept turning it down. And I was in the middle of this kind of excruciating meeting with her in her office, in which she was explaining to me yet again why the book wasn't ready and she wasn't buying it yet. And in the middle of this meeting, I just suddenly said to her, well, okay, I have this other idea. And I just kind of gushed out this half-formed story about a washed-up writer who has a terrible student, and the student has a brilliant idea. And you know, the washed-up writer eventually discovers that his student has died and helps himself to the story, not to a word of the manuscript, because there is no manuscript, but just to the story, and mayhem ensues. And she got so excited about this idea that she basically told me, put the other one aside, write this. And then we had this pandemic. I don't know if you heard about that, but suddenly I was in a very remote house in upstate New York, and more grateful than I have ever been in my life to have a writing project. And I just kind of blasted through it in the winter and spring of 2020. So my feelings at the time were not make it a page turner. It was more like get through this horrible period and get to the other side of this incredibly propulsive, to me, project.
Well, for all of us, we're very glad that COVID forced you to be creative. And
I made no banana bread. I made no sourdough bread. I did not take up macrame. This is all I did.
So Laura, Dream Girl, which is, I've always enjoyed your books, as you well know. Was it a book that you wrote? Oh, was it Coleridge who wrote Kubla Khan in a dream state? Did you write Dream Girl in a dream state? Because it has this strange phantasmagoric air about it, this strange air of unreality.
It feels a little feverish, yeah. But I worked on it from January 2019 until June 1st, 2020. So I think a lot of that feverish quality came from the fact that I finished it and of course polished it and redrafted it during the early part of the pandemic. And life felt surreal, and it was God, it's always hard to talk about this, it's like this horrible thing was happening, but I was so grateful to get up every morning and have something to do, have something that had to be done. It was due. I was actually a little past deadline, and the real world had sort of conspired to catch up with me. I'm writing this novel about someone who's stuck in his apartment because he's had an injury and who finds his life increasingly surreal and having trouble telling real from, imagination, from delusion. So it fed into what was going on in a very bizarre and sometimes almost uncomfortable way. I mean, it's still hard. I know people who get very upset if anyone tries to say there was any silver lining in 2020. They feel that that's disrespectful to the hundreds of thousands of lives lost, and I get that. But it was kind of, I see Jean nodding because I think she had the same experience. There was sort of this weird salvation for me personally, just to be able to write during that time and to have to write. I had a lot of friends who really struggled because their deadlines were a lot further down the road. And and they just kind of like couldn't stop watching the news and couldn't stop doom scrolling. And I was just like, oh, thank God I have something that is actually organizing my day.
Well, actually, it's quite interesting you raise that, because I think we all share a communal guilt that, like you two, I did a lot of work during COVID. It didn't really impact. You knew that out in the real world, people were losing their jobs, businesses were going bust, but we three were able to carry on. So do you think, Jean, that comes under, you once said that writers are self-flagellating. Do you think is that what we're doing now?
Well, I mean, there's just, look at this. I mean, all three of us have expressed gratitude and guilt in the same, in the same small time period. I felt guilty every day. I was staying off the news and off Twitter because I was actually very afraid of this happening before it happened. I remember telling people in December and even November of 2019 that I felt we were in the opening chapters of The Stand, basically. And when they said to me, no, it's not going to be like that, and I would say, tell me more. I desperately wanted to be wrong. But the weird thing was that once it actually happened, it's not that I wasn't afraid anymore. I just put the fear on the back burner, because what was the point of being afraid of it? It was happening. There was no preventing it anymore.
Yes.
So I really checked out into my writing project, and I feel devastated for all the suffering that's gone on, and guilty that I had a productive time.
So Laura, are you a self-flagellating type? What do you beat yourself up about?
Oh gosh, so much. A lot of it is about the quality of my parenting, and that has really been challenged.
I'm sure you're an admirable parent, Laura.
You might, if my daughter were here, she'd love to enter an opinion. We've just she's 11, and we had this pretty hilarious conversation this week where I told her, I said, I've just come to understand that you have reached an age where it's your job to hate me. It's like, that's your job. I get it. You do your job. I'm going to be here doing my job, which is getting you to places on time, making sure you have food and clothing. And, and as you hurl vitriol at me, I'm just going to try to roll with it. And it actually is kind of working for now. We'll see what happens next. But yeah, of course I think that in the United States right now, if you got through 2020 with relatively little pain or sacrifice, you're going to feel guilty and self-flagellating about that. I mean, I feel guilty about making a living as a writer because so many people don't get to do that. And yes. I know that it's not a meritocracy. It's not about who's the best. I love Twitter, and I did a thread the other day about why I pay for so much content through Patreon and other newsletter services, because a lot of these things are written by younger people who, I mean, I'm a boomer, I'm loathed, I understand it.
Same here.
I had a real gig. I worked for newspapers for a total of 20 years. And last year, it turned out that I had a pension that I could take as a lump sum because it wasn't so huge. I was only at my second newspaper job for 8 years, but there's money. And I said to some of my young friends, like, oh my God, I have a pension. And one of them's like, what's a pension? And the other one said, what's money? It's sort of the gap between. So that's something that, if you want to talk about self-flagellating, I really try to support other writers financially, because I had a career in media, which a lot of, with benefits and pension and 401k. And I've been publishing. Next year will be my 25th year of being a novelist. And I've been supporting myself as a novelist since 2001. That's,
Well, you have to say that the one thing you can't say to civilians is you've got trouble with deadlines. Because if you say that to people who are trying to be published, they'll say, my heart bleeds for you.
Yeah.
You're earning your living as a writer and you're complaining about deadlines.
I try never to complain about my life.
So, Jean,
not in public, certainly.
There's one thing that, when they say that when America sneezes, Britain catches a cold, it's not the other way around. So what we're importing from you are various things which I don't know how you feel about them. One is the notion of cultural appropriation. So both of you have chosen to write, and surely this was not acceptable, with male protagonists. Jean, why did you do that?
That's my first male protagonist, and all I can say is he was always who he was. He arrived. He did not need to be regendered. He was who he was, and I had plenty of apprehension about writing a male character, but if I can't do it after 7 novels, I just don't know, if it would ever happen.
But if you can't do it per se, I think it'd be kind of worrying if we could only write from our own experience and from our own background.
That you just put your finger on the problem for all of the the sign carrying about how we fiction writers are only supposed to be writing from our own lived experience, which is happening. If people really stop to think about what that would mean for the books that were written, they wouldn't be called novels, they would be called memoirs.
Yes.
And we would have to go back and rid the shelves of all of the great novels. So,
well, we'd have to get rid of Patricia Highsmith's Ripley books for start with her writing.
I don't want to do that. I mean, and I'm thinking, what about Madame Bovary? What
yes, Anna Karenina,
so
Molly Bloom.
People have this idea that we're not allowed to use our imaginations, and I'm thinking of my friend Janine Cummins, who got excoriated for writing beyond her lived experience, and I just think it's a very short-sighted and stupid way to look at what writers do, what we can offer.
Have you had experience of this, Laura? Have you been criticized for writing male characters, or have you got off lightly?
Well, this was my first male protagonist too. The thing is like, I've really been interested in this issue of appropriation for a while. And if you go back to the book I published in 2019, Lady in the Lake, it's absolutely a meta commentary on appropriation. It's about my life. It's the story of an ambitious white woman whose desire is to become more successful by writing about the death of a Black woman. And, the Black woman who appears in the book From Beyond the Grave has the line, "You weren't interested in my life, you were interested in my death. They're not the same thing." I'm fascinated by this topic. Obviously, I'm in favor of writers using their imagination. I think that the conversation is extremely complicated and subtle. And one of the things, I was actually on a panel with Walter Mosley, and we were in New York, and someone got up and was told that they tried to write a novel that was outside their experience, and they were told this will never sell. And Walter and I were like, okay, but was it good?
Exactly.
It's like, this is like the thing no one wants to talk about. It's like, okay, I mean, I've taken to the idea that writers should be daring, they should go outside their own experience, but they have to understand they might get it wrong. And then they have to kind of listen and pay attention to where they might have screwed up. And I had the experience recently of going through a bunch of my short stories that are going to be published next year, and they were written over a 10-year span. And I decided this isn't so much about appropriation, although that came up. I had a story that part of it was told from the point of view of a Black teenager. And I looked at it hard and I was like, my main question looking at it was, am I writing a story in which the Black person exists to sort of uphold and help the white person? You know, what am I doing in this story? I mean, I live in a city that is 2/3 Black. If I don't write about race, I'm not writing about my life, actually.
Mm-hmm.
I think it has been an advantage to me that I've lived most of my life in Baltimore, and I lived 6 years, how long? 6 years in San Antonio. So I've had the experience of being a minority in terms of, you know, not being the majority race in a city, which is a good thing to know. It's really a thorny question. What I dislike is the glib reply that I've heard at conferences where someone says, well, I'm not a firefighter and I wrote about a firefighter. I'm like, come on, it's a little more complicated than that.
It's more nuanced than that, isn't it?
Yeah, but I mean, I think the conversation needs to keep going and people just need to be really attentive. And
well, are they though, Laura? Because, and I'll ask this question really to Jean, what we get in Britain is the sense that American campuses now with trigger warnings, the students are terrified of being disturbed by a book. They don't want to come across, is this an accurate picture of the American campus, that the students are all desperately afraid of being disturbed by literature?
Oh, God. Well, can I take that one?
Yep.
My last novel before the plot was called The Devil in Webster, and it was set on a college campus, a liberal college campus. And I got to really do a deep dive in some of these questions. But I'm also a faculty spouse at Princeton, and I have been for 30 years. And I love Princeton, and I love Princeton students. But I have been horrified by some of the things that I've been aware of. I mean, there a few years ago, there was a class being taught, I don't know which department, it could have been sociology or linguistics, I don't know, but it was about hate speech. The class was about hate speech. And there were objections from the students because hate speech was being used. I mean, come on. You have to be able to experience the material and study the material. So it is pretty horrifying. But if you look at the history of campuses as hothouses of these ideas, you see that if you wait long enough, it will pass. It may pass to something even worse, I don't know. But at the moment, yes, the students, and I have a college-age son, yeah, they're very, very preoccupied with these micro issues of language.
So, Laura, is your 11-year-old daughter likely to grow into someone who'll say, I don't want to read anything which will disturb me? Or being your daughter, surely she's won't have that problem.
she likes, this is a kid who, she's pretty hard-boiled. I showed her Jaws this summer, and at the scene where the child that's about her age is attacked by the shark and you see blood just plume into the air, my daughter screamed out gleefully, "Fruit punch!" So no, I don't think she's gonna err on the side of not wanting to be challenged by what she reads and sees. But at the same time, I'm glad she's like becoming really aware of some stuff. I was driving her to camp this morning and we were listening to a local news report about, I think there's a term, and it might be blue lining, but I'm not sure, but it's like pockets of cities where the Wi-Fi is so poor that it's actually affecting the quality of people's lives, especially during the pandemic where people were working from home and going to school from home, and their Wi-Fi connections couldn't support the activity within their household. And so my daughter listened to that and she's like, well, is that about being poor or is that about race? And I said, well, it's actually about both, because in the United States, it's hard to talk about poverty without talking about race. And I was just like so excited that my daughter's thinking like that, that she's beginning to make these connections of how systemic racism has been in the United States, and how there are all these things that we try to pretend race isn't part of, but it's like, yeah, you can't really talk about that unless you're willing to talk about race.
Mm-hmm. Now you've both admitted that this is your first male protagonist, Central. So, Jean, you haven't hardly picked an admirable character for your first male protagonist, have you?
Well, in that he's got everything in common with all my other protagonists. I've always been plagued by what I call the cult of the likable protagonist, especially female protagonists. People are so enraged if you present them with a female character in particular who is less than perfection. And I've never understood this. I mean, I've been a reader of novels since I was 6 or 7 years old. I have never required my the protagonists in the books that I read to be likable. In fact, I kind of prefer them not that likable. And my favorite novels have featured protagonists who are really less than likable. So I don't get this. When I hear from readers who say, "Oh, I just didn't like her," I just want to say, I'm sure she wouldn't like you either. But what are we talking about here? Are you looking for a best friend in the pages of a book? Because she's not real.
Well, isn't there another pressure on women writers, which doesn't exist on male writers? I've seen it in the liberal papers over here. Writers criticized for not being sisterly in their approach to other women, as if women are obliged to support other women in the arts. Men don't get that, or maybe because men just do it unconsciously anyway. Do you think, Laura?
Men do it unconsciously anyway?
Okay.
Yeah. Well, first of all, Barry, I'm coming out of crime, which is an incredibly, for the most part, pretty close-knit, supportive group. And, and part of that is because of groups like Sisters in Crime. So I feel that I've seen men and women be pretty supportive, and I haven't experienced that, the idea of ever being called out because I couldn't be supportive of another writer. I mean, when I don't like something, I'm pretty quiet about it. It doesn't give me a lot of joy to talk about what I dislike. I mean, but the whole likable character thing, I teach writing in a program at Eckerd College, although it's for people outside the university. We have our workshops there in January. And my students will come in and say, well, I was told that, my book wasn't publishable because the character isn't likable. And I said, that's really probably not the problem. The problem is your book isn't engaging for some reason. And that's an easy way to sort of dismiss a book. It's like someone saying, yeah, I can't go out with you Saturday night because I need to wash my hair. It's just, it's just meaningless. It's just something to say. Yeah. And don't get attached to it. I said, think about Hannibal Lecter. Hannibal Lecter is not likable. People sure like to read about him. So what we're talking about is, are they interesting? Are they charismatic? Do you want to follow them through the story? And, I started off in a series book. A lot of people found Tess Monahan unlikable. I'm like, she's out of a job and she's trying to just get through life with these, various odd jobs. Of course, she's like, people aren't likable when they're out of work and struggling. That doesn't make people nicer. And that's followed with, gosh, I think it's rare that I have written some people that I found likable. In particular, I think the character in I'd Know You Anywhere is incredibly likable. But in general, no, I don't. I like to write people who are smaller than life.
Yes.
Kind of mean and petty.
That's quite a good phrase. I'm not sure that's ever going to get used on your blurbs, Laura, by your publisher, but it's a good phrase.
Smaller than life. That's so great.
So, yeah. Jean, what do you think is? I think you wrote somewhere about your character's guilty of, what should we say, borrowing? Should we use a stronger phrase than borrowing?
I think appropriation is a good term. One thing he's not is a plagiarist, and obviously we can't control how people talk about our work, but I do find it frustrating when people describe the central act in the plot as an act of plagiarism. He does not take a single word from his late student.
That's surely the difference, isn't it? If he only takes a concept rather than a word. Yeah. And And I can never understand why writers in the modern age do plagiarize, because your sin will find you out.
I know.
It's very easy to find those, isn't it? The recent examples of that, where people have found whole paragraphs just relocated. I think even Joe Biden was guilty of it, wasn't he? He borrowed
one of his speechwriters did.
Yeah, his speechwriter. Well done.
No, he was a long time ago. It was pre-internet, and it was one of his speechwriters. And you get the speech from your speechwriter, make a few changes. You don't then start calling people up to check the sources. I mean, he had a relationship of trust with his speechwriter. Anyway,
it was perfectly. That was a good defense, Jean. I was very impressed with.
Even at the time, I was sympathetic to him, but of course, it's going to be the word. I mean, and this is what Jake, the protagonist of the plot, is so worried about. That once that word is attached to you, it's attached. I mean, the list of American writers who have been accused of plagiarism includes Stephen King, who's written about it, Joyce Carol Oates. I mean, all sorts of people who, guess what, did not plagiarize. Doesn't
Steven Spielberg have a team of people who are ready for all the accusations as each film appears of plagiarism?
Well, that's smart.
Somebody will say, well, I sent you my idea in 2020, and here it is appearing in your new film.
Yep.
And I can prove that I sent.
Well, the studios won't accept over the transom.
No, exactly.
Yeah. But I mean, look at J.K. Rowling. Some lady in Pennsylvania self-published a book with the word "muggles" in the title, and she got a lawsuit. So yes. I mean, we're incredibly vulnerable. And by the way, that case that involved Stephen King and Joyce Carol Oates involved a mentally ill woman in Princeton, where I used to live, who accused both of these authors of breaking into her home and photographing what was on her typewriter. So that's what we're dealing with.
We are into the realms of extreme paranoia. But going back to male protagonists, Laura, I think Gerry Anderson, how easy did you find it to put yourself in his mindset? Because he's not an admirable character, but he's vaguely sympathetic.
It was disturbingly easy to get into Gerry's mind. And Gerry is, you want to talk about, like what scares you? Nothing really worries or scares me more than people who move through the world with the concept that they're good. I find people who believe themselves to be good to be extremely dangerous, because once you sort of entrench this idea of, but I'm good, I'm a good person, you can do so much harm. And it was so important to me, and it's not for me to say whether it happened, but it was what I really wanted to do in writing Dream Girl, is I wanted the reader, despite being trapped in Gerry's mind, to pick up really fast that this guy is not a good guy, even though we only have his testimony about how he's behaved in the past. And over the course of the novel, the facts accrue, and we're like, whoa, he's really not a good guy. But that's a kind of person who's always interested me, because I think they really do the most harm.
Well, I'm going to say a line here that only Laura Lippman will recognize, Jean. You can be forgiven for this. It's a line from a musical, Carousel. There's nothing so bad for a woman as a man who thinks he's good.
Oh, we could sing it together in the bar one day, baby.
I wouldn't recognize that line.
I know that Laura's a big musicals fan too.
As am I.
Well, there we are. So, do you think, going back to an element that's in Dream Girl, the Me Too movement, has this caused in your country and mine an existential crisis between the sexes, or is it not about bad guys anymore? It's about all guys, that good guys, we haven't called out the bad guys sufficiently.
The guys keep coming back. Louis C.K. is about to go on tour. Andrew Cuomo, last I checked, is still the governor of New York.
No, he's now resigned, I believe.
Did he today?
I think he just has, yeah.
Oh, okay, because I've been offline all day, but it was like up until he was borrowing heavily from the "I'm not leaving" handbook, and his defenses of himself are just crazy.
Yeah.
So I was a big fan of the show on Apple, a show I love, whose name I now, The Morning Show. And I thought it was really interesting that this character played by Steve Carell, who seemed to be like a Matt Lauer news anchor, really wanted to press forward this idea that we're in a second wave of Me Too. And the first wave was really bad guys, but now we're taking down pretty decent people whose only sin was maybe a consensual, and I was like, yeah, I don't think we've gotten all the bad guys yet. I don't see I don't see Me Too having had dangerous and far-reaching repercussions. I know some individuals who, yeah, inevitably they're going to be individuals who get ground up in the machinery, but I don't find it out of control. I don't. It's just.
Would you agree, Jean? So would you say that it's not an existential crisis? It is at the moment still the bad guys who are being brought down.
Well, first of all, show me a moment in history when there has not been an existential crisis between women and men.
Very good point.
Left the Garden of Eden, and
Yes.
And now, the crisis is refracted in a way, because not refracted, diffract. Never mind. Some kind of fracted, in that we're not two genders anymore. There's kind of more ways to be oppressed. I agree with you that first wave was about the monsters, and now we seem to have downshifted to a lower level of monster. To me, the biggest ridiculousness was with Al Franken. I mean, that Al Franken took a juvenile Harvard Lampoon circa 1965 photograph, and we lost one of the great senators that we've had in recent years as a result. Is the kind of idiocy that is going to come back and bite us. But yeah, I agree with Laura that I think that the movement, I mean, we've been waiting for this for a long, we were marching for this in the 80s. I was marching in the 80s, my mother was marching in the 60s. It's about time. And I'm sorry that there's some collateral damage along the way, but I don't think anyone too inappropriate, maybe apart from Al Franken, has been sacrificed yet.
Well, we've got about 5 minutes left, and I think we've conveyed just how good the plot and Dream Girl are. So I'm going to ask you both a question that you can't answer in 5 minutes, but I'm going to start anyway. Laura, what was it like living in Donald Trump's America?
So first of all, I don't think I understood how awful it was until it was over. And it wasn't over until after January 20th. I mean, January 6th, I don't think I'll ever. So I'll tell the story myself, because unlike Jean, I didn't see the pandemic coming, and I'm a little bit Pollyannish. I did not understand how bad things are going to be until the New York Times at the end of 2020 ran the story about Donald Trump's phone calls to the Secretary of State of Georgia. I was like, oh my God, Jen, this is going to be bad. And January 6th was, of course, horrible. And that was just, I've read my journals from that day, and I still get upset thinking about it. And then to get through January 20th, and then all of a sudden, he did kind of disappear. And just having his voice gone was such a relief. The absence of something was when I could finally focus on how awful it had been. And we're still living with it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a lot of the craziness around COVID in the United States has to do with how it's politicized, which just strikes me as egregious and villainous. And I hope that the planet lasts long enough for the history of this to be told properly. I still, in some ways, we're still living in Donald Trump's America, because he left behind 30% of the voting population who believe in him.
Mm-hmm.
And it's...
Well, in this country, we were kind of shocked by the senators who were in fear of their life, who are now saying, well, it really didn't happen, or it didn't quite happen like that. We were not really in fear of our life, but there was a mob, it seems, chanting, hang Mike Pence, was there not?
Yeah.
Which is ironic that he became a hate figure for the right, which is set irony there over here, we thought. What do you think, Jean? Were you, was it all like a phantasmagoric period, the Trump period, which is now hopefully fading?
I actually, you articulated pretty much perfectly what it was like for me. Those 4 years were, a lot of my energy was going into sort of paddling underwater to sort of get through it. And when it looked like he might have prevailed, it was just unspeakable. the horror. It was really a moment out of Conrad. I used to joke that we found the worst person in America and made him president. And after the first impeachment, when that went the way it was always going to go, I remember saying to my husband, I'm out. I can't be emotionally invested in this anymore. We just have to get to election day. But then the notion that even having seen everything that we'd seen, that there might be still so many people who twisted themselves and chucked their own principles, their own stated principles, even their politics to support him was just unbelievable. I still can't believe it. I mean, in a way, for a novelist like me who's obsessed with liars, the ways we lie, which has been the connective tissue in a lot of my books, to have this kind of front row seat to the greatest liar of all time, the greatest snake oil salesman that America has ever produced. And that's saying something, because our country has been a story of liars and fabulous from the beginning. It was extraordinary and absolutely horrible.
Well, I couldn't resist.
PTSD, I believe.
I couldn't resist asking you both that final question. So I read a hell of a lot of crime novels, as you know, and I have to say that the plot and Dream Girl, I didn't mind. I didn't mind staying up into the wee small hours, but we do need to see you both in the United Kingdom, I think. It's very nice seeing you electronically, but we need to see you physically as well. But I would like to thank Jean Hanff Korelitz and Laura Lippman. Thank you both. Jonathan, you still watching us?
I am.
Yes. Have you got everything you need?
Absolutely fabulous. And
okay.
What a great and gripping conversation. Thank you.
It was enjoyable, wasn't it?
Much.
Good night, all.
Really
and
great.
see you in the UK. Bye.
They can find you a book for your girlfriend, your husband, your girl, or your boy. And if you've got a need for an uplifting read, Justine and Jonathan can pick out a book you'll enjoy. What a book at the Bookseller Crow on the hill. What a book at the Bookseller Crow on the hill. Crystal Palace Hill, it is. But you can order online.